welcome. This is the 2022 Prop 68 MPA and Climate Solicitation Informational Webinar. Thank you so much for joining today. My name is Elise Goen. I am the 2022 California Sea Grant Fellow with Ocean Protection Council, and I serve within the Biodiversity Program. I am joined today by a few members of the Ocean Protection Council, or OPC, who will help facilitate this meeting and be available to answer questions during the Q&A period later on. We have Tova Handelman here today, who is the Senior Marine Protected Areas Manager. We also have Mike Esgro as the Senior Biodiversity Program Manager and Tribal Liaison. And I think we will be joined by Holly Shand, who is our Admin and Finance Manager, later on to help with our Q&A section. I also want to mention that Lindsay Bonito, who could not attend this webinar today, is the Marine Protected Areas Program Manager, and she is the co-lead on this project. So Lindsay and myself will be monitoring the Prop 68 Chapter 9 at resources.ca.gov email throughout this entire process, and we will be your main points of contact for this solicitation. So if you have emailed or will email in the future, you will most likely hear from myself or from Lindsay. So we do have a full hour for this webinar, and I'd like to get started right away. We are going to answer all of our Q&A questions at the end, but first I would like to go over a few webinar logistics to get us started off on the right foot. So this entire presentation and Q&A session will be recorded and made available on OPC's Prop 68 webpage, along with the slide deck that you are now viewing. So I do suggest that you check the webpage that will be updated and posted in the coming weeks. The webpage will be posted in the chat, and it is also here on the screen for you. So that way you can view the presentation recording and any other updates that pop up in the future. So we have Tova here who will be posting links to the various forms and documents that I will be mentioning, but all of the links can be found throughout the solicitation itself, and it is also on the Prop 68 webpage. So if you didn't get a chance to copy down something from the chat, go ahead and visit that Prop 68 funding page. We do ask that you remain on mute for the entirety of this presentation so that staff can better monitor our webinar today. All questions will be answered at the conclusion of the presentation portion of the webinar, and that will be during the Q&A. So please hold on to those questions until we approach that time so that we can answer everything appropriately. Please use the chat box when it is time to type in your questions, or use the raise hand function, which can be found at the bottom of your screen, to allow us to unmute you in the order that questions appear. Questions that are asked during this section and during next week's virtual office hour will be compiled into a written FAQ page that will appear on the Prop 68 webpage in the coming weeks. So please reserve very specific questions for email to that Prop 68 Chapter 9 email. And I believe we are recording, so I will go ahead and begin. This is the plan for today's webinar. We will begin with a brief overview to the Ocean Protection Council and to Proposition 68, which is how we got the funding for this grant solicitation. Then we will discuss the funding available for this round of Chapter 9 projects. Following that, we will go into the solicitation timeline, process, applicant, and project eligibility. And the bulk of the presentation will be spent on the project priorities themselves. And then lastly, we will go into the application instructions, the letter of intent form, and next steps for all those interested. And like I mentioned before, the Q&A will be reserved for the very end of the webinar. To begin, the Ocean Protection Council, or OPC, is a cabinet-level state agency whose job is to protect and conserve California's ocean and marine resources for the benefit of current and future generations. OPC has a significant position in California government as a policy lead that promotes coordination with other agencies, California Native American tribes, and stakeholders. We seek and leverage funding, use the best available science to inform decision-making, all while operating with accountability and transparency. For today, we will be focusing specifically on the leveraging funding responsibility that OPC has. Guiding all of OPC's activities and priorities lies within the strategic plan to protect California's coast and ocean. As an agency, this version of the strategic plan was adopted in 2020, and it contains actions for 5 years worth of priorities nestled under 4 main goals. Everything that we do can be connected back to those goals and targets found within this document, and this grant solicitation that we are discussing is no different. I highly encourage you all here today to read through this plan to better understand what we do here at OPC. And the link to the strategic plan will be sent in the chat right about now if it's not already there. And it can also be found on our OPC webpage. One of the responsibilities of OPC that I mentioned before is concerned with funding for the coast and ocean. One source of funding for these efforts comes from Proposition 68. And this is the source of the funds for the eventual projects selected at the end of this process, pending council approval. Prop 68 was approved in 2018 by voters, and OPC received a portion of those funds to support projects that provide Californians with access to safe natural spaces and to ensure that there are continued investments in the state's diverse ecosystems to ensure high quality of life for all Californians. Prop 68 can be further divided by chapter, and Chapter 9 is devoted to projects that conserve, protect, and restore marine wildlife and healthy ocean and coastal ecosystems. This is the chapter that we find ourselves in for this round of grant funding. And this happens to be the very first round of competitive funding for the Chapter 9 funds. OPC received a total of $35 million for this chapter of funding to specifically initiate ocean, bay, and coastal protection priorities. Prop 68 has grant guidelines that can dictate how projects can be pursued, and we must follow the guidelines for the overall proposition, but also for Chapter 9 more specifically. A link to the Prop 68 grant guidelines will be put into the chat for your review. For this first round of Prop 68 Chapter 9 funding, there is $2 million available for projects that are aligned with OPC's strategic plan and that satisfy the grant guidelines and solicitation priorities. The minimum amount that can be awarded is $250,000, and the maximum amount is $1 million. These amounts will make more sense when we discuss the solicitation priorities later on. The maximum project length is 2 years. So projects that are selected and approved, they will need to begin work in the spring of 2023 and must be wrapped up by the summer of 2025. And just as a reminder, the letter of intent, or LOI, is due by July 29th, 2022. So if you have already read through the solicitation that was released last Friday, this timeline should look pretty familiar to you. But if you have not yet read it, it is available on the Prop 68 webpage or at the link in the chat that will take you directly to the grant proposal solicitation. It has a slew of events and dates that are very important, but the next important date on this timeline is the LOI due date. And I do emphasize that we need to receive all LOIs by 5:00 p.m. for complete submission. I will walk through the LOI process and requirements during this webinar so that you are prepared to send your application in on time. The next date that I want to bring to your attention is for September 6th, which is the date where we will inform selected applicants to submit a full proposal. That is the day after Labor Day, and that is the date where all applicants will hear back about their proposals. The last day that I want to point out to you all is in February 2023. That is the first quarterly council meeting of the year 2023, where staff intends to present selected projects from this solicitation to the council members for their approval. And following this meeting is the earliest that projects can start working. So sometime in spring of 2023, we will have projects begin. Now moving on to the actual application process for this solicitation. There are two documents that you will need to open and download. They are the letter of intent instructions and the letter of intent form number 394. The LOI instruction sheet will help explain the steps needed to complete the LOI form, which will be turned in by July 29th. Only the completed LOI form needs to be emailed in at this time, with any additional maps of the project area or photos as optional, definitely not required. We do ask that the form be no longer than 8 pages in length for this first phase of the submission. If you need the links to all of these documents, they will be dropped in the chat box, or they can be found on the Prop 68 webpage. So these two documents I'm mentioning again are the letter of intent instructions and the letter of intent form. So there will be a second phase reserved for full project proposals. And at that point, we will allow selected applicants to dive in deeper to their projects. At that time, if you are selected, a new full proposal template will be provided to you to fill out, along with additional forms such as CEQA, NEPA, and others. That template will not be released until early to mid-September. Lastly, I do want to be clear that even if projects are selected by OPC staff, all projects need to receive OPC council approval at the February 2023 meeting next year. Now I would like to talk a little bit about eligibility for Prop 68 funding. So we are having applicants eligible from many groups. These groups include California Native American tribes that are federally recognized and non-federally recognized, listed on the Native American Heritage Commission contact list. We are also looking for applicants involved in local, state, or federal agencies, public or private universities, private nonprofit organizations that include community-based groups that qualify under Section 5013 of the Internal Revenue Service. Projects that are eligible must be consistent with general obligation bond law, which holds that selected projects must provide the state with long-term benefits. And this long-term is seen as 15 to 30 years. These projects must comply with CEQA and other environmental state law, and projects must be ready to begin right after council approval and end 2 years later in summer of 2025. Prop 68 also requires that at least 50% of all OPC allotted funds across all chapters fund and benefit severely disadvantaged communities. Applicants are encouraged to submit projects that provide benefits to disadvantaged or severely disadvantaged communities, although it is not explicitly required. To determine if your project will fall into this category, use the California State Parks Fact Finder Map Viewer, which can be found within the solicitation itself. And also, we will drop a link to the map in the chat box for you. To get a full view in more detail of the eligibility requirements for Prop 68 Chapter 9 funding, please take a look at the grant guidelines that have been posted on the Prop 68 webpage, and they are also listed within the solicitation themselves. All right, now it's time to move on to the actual project priorities for this solicitation. So the main goal for this solicitation is to understand how California's MPA network operates and its role in a changing climate variability, and marine heat waves in the lives of key species, habitats, or human activities. The priorities for this solicitation came from recommendations in the Climate Resilience and California's Marine Protected Area Network report that was written last year by an OPC Science Advisory Team and the Ocean Science Trust. OPC eventually funding these projects are a result of the recommendations within that Climate Resilience and MPA Network report, and it is written in our OPC strategic plan. Therefore, all projects should aim to advance implementation of the strategic plan, especially those related to the MPA network, climate change resilience, equity, and adaptive management. These projects need to help move the needle and inform adaptive management of the MPA network and provide direct management tools for managers. All projects must provide benefits to the San Francisco Bay and to the coastal region. Out of all the recommendations within that climate and MPAs report, we decided to focus on 3 different priority areas or types that will be fulfilled through research-based projects. I will go over each priority briefly with you all now, but please thoroughly read through the priorities found in page 5 of the grant solicitation to understand exactly what we're asking for. So the 3 projects include ecological resilience through climate refugia, model habitat and species distributions, and social values relating to MPAs and climate resilience. For this first priority, we are looking for projects that can investigate and identify climate refugia in California coastal systems and assess MPA's effects on important conditions that affect focal taxa of MPA monitoring. Characteristics of this research can include physical, ecological, and biological characteristics of climate refugia. Projects in this priority type should investigate spatial distribution of MPAs relative to historic and current stressor exposures and how these stressors can evolve in the future. The next priority is focused on modeling habitat and species distributions in current and future conditions to inform risk assessments of species, ecosystems, and habitats within MPAs. Projects will consider important conditions that affect focal taxa of MPA monitoring, including but not limited to physiological tolerances, tipping point thresholds, species and ecological community range shifts, and genetic diversity. Projects can feature risk assessments for species that are targeted for long-term MPA monitoring. A list of these species can be found in the 2018 MPA Monitoring Action Plan, specifically on pages 33 through 40, and referring to tables 7 through 10. A link to this MPA Monitoring Action Plan will be added into the chat for your reference, and it also is listed within the solicitation priorities. Projects that aim to assess culturally important species should be able to describe how the lead investigators will engage with tribes and other communities to determine cultural importance. And for our third priority, this one is focused on social resilience outcomes of MPAs in the face of a changing climate within the state of California. These proposed projects could identify and assess important gaps in our understanding of the interactions between MPAs and social resilience, given climate change. Projects will investigate the role that MPAs play in protecting species or ecosystems that are considered culturally important to various societal groups, or what species or ecosystems are considered important to society beyond economic or consumptive uses. So that was a very brief run through of the 3 project priority types. Like I said before, I really do urge you all to read through those priorities within the solicitation and read the supporting documents that are listed with the entire document. So now I'll go over some of our application instructions, which includes reading that solicitation as well as the OPC Prop 68 grant guidelines. Once you have reviewed these, you are ready to start and submit your letter of intent application. So you will download the LOI form and fill it out according to the LOI instructions, both of which can be found on the Prop 68 webpage, and they have been listed in the chat multiple times before. So I'm sure you can find them here. They are found on the Prop 68 funding webpage. Once the LOI form is filled out and is no longer than 8 pages, a finished copy can be emailed to our email address, which is also listed on the screen, prop68ch9@resources.ca.gov, using the subject line Prop 68 application - your organization name. And we would like to receive this again no later than 5 p.m. on July 29th. This email address is also available to you for any questions regarding the solicitation or for technical assistance that may be needed throughout. Now I will briefly go over what you can expect on that LOI form if you haven't had a chance to look at it yet. So the first page is a cover page that will collect summary information of general things about the organization and the contact person for the project proposal. It will collect high-level project information such as the amount of funding requested and also location information for the research project. Then on pages 2 and 3, there are eligibility questions about the applicant and the project. A lot of those questions we have already gone over today in this webinar, so they should be very similar to what was discussed. And finally, on page 4, you will be given the space to describe the proposed project, community engagement, partnerships, and collaboration. You can also see tables to complete referring to a preliminary budget and project schedule. These don't need to be absolutely final and concrete, but they do need to be as accurate as possible at this LOI stage. Again, all instructions are available on the instructions document and should make these questions very straightforward and simple to complete. This form has tables and editable boxes that applicants will be able to extend to fully complete, but the LOI package should be no more than 8 pages total. Photos or maps that are submitted to show severely disadvantaged community benefit extent or other project research sites will not count towards that 8-page maximum. We are not accepting any other attachments at this time, but we will be explicit in what we need for the full proposal submission phase if selected. All right, that was a lot of information. I just want to provide everyone with a few next steps if you find that you are right for this solicitation, and before we move on to the Q&A session. So if any more questions arise after this webinar ends, we will be hosting a virtual office hour on Thursday, July 14th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. The Zoom link will be dropped into the chat box, and it is also seen here on the screen at the Prop 68 funding webpage. There is no registration required for that virtual office hour, but we do ask that applicants come prepared with your own questions, as there will be no presentation, there will be no new information at that time. It is your time to ask questions. We are also available for written questions throughout this entire solicitation period at our email, prop68ch9@resources.ca.gov. We also ask that you continue checking the Prop 68 webpage within the coming weeks for any updates or changes to the information that I presented today. That webpage is the best and fastest way for us to spread information about these updates, if there are any. So we will be posting there as needed, and it will show up at the very top of the page if there are updates. Also, we will have an FAQ, or frequently asked questions page, that will be posted to the Prop 68 webpage. And this will contain general questions asked during this webinar Q&A session, also during next week's virtual office hour, and via email. If anybody has general questions by email, we will be compiling all of those questions into the FAQ document that will be continuously updated and posted on our webpage. Also, lastly, the slides that you viewed today and also this recording of the webinar will be posted on that Prop 68 webpage pretty soon, within the coming weeks. So we have a bunch of time left for our Q&A session. We have Mike Esgro here to answer our questions, as well as Tova Handelman. So they know a ton. Please use the chat box if you would like to, or you can raise your hand using the raise hand function that is found at the bottom of your screen. We will get to as many questions as we can. Like I said before, we will be compiling all these questions and putting them into the FAQ document. So if we don't get to your question today, it will be answered at some point in the future. And if you have very, very specific questions about your personal project, I'd like to recommend that you email us at prop68ch9@resources.ca.gov so that we can give you that personal attention there. And we cannot give comment on specific project ideas, but we are very happy to clarify some of the eligibility requirements or priorities. And so with that, I will pass things off to Mike.
Thanks so much, Elise, and thank you for that really clear and cogent presentation. So hopefully that clarifies, not only the intent of our Prop 68 program, but our goals, excuse me, really for this solicitation in particular. Yeah, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Mike Esgro. Together with my colleague Tova Handelman, who's also on this call, I co-lead our efforts around all things biodiversity here at OPC, which includes marine protected areas. So yeah, Tova and I will be doing our best to answer questions that folks may have. So got a couple coming in right away through the chat. So first off, someone asks, if OPC has 35 million, why is there only 2 million available this round? And can we expect larger pots in future years? Yeah, definitely a fair question. That 35 million that we're getting through Chapter 9 of Prop 68 really does need to support all of our priorities in on sort of the biodiversity and blue economy side of our work at OPC. So this 2 million is sort of the initial investment that our team and OPC leadership determined was appropriate coming out of the MPAs and climate report that Elise noted earlier. So doesn't preclude additional investments down the road, but that is the amount that we're investing now. There was a question that I answered in the chat, but just to clarify here, coastal or San Francisco Bay habitats. So it doesn't need to include San Francisco Bay. Another question, must be in California. Yes, that's correct. So this is all for California. Another question, can you pay for permitting and design for a coastal wetlands lagoon restoration project? Can the program potentially pay for implementation for a coastal wetlands lagoon restoration project? We would consider both planning and implementation. And restoration, I think, could potentially fit. There just needs to be a nexus with one of those 3 priority areas that Elise went over. Elise, would you agree with that?
I do agree. I just want to make sure that it's whatever the project is, that it's explicitly going to be addressed by those priorities. So if the goal of the project is implementation or restoration, these are all mainly research-based. So yeah, consider.
Mm-hmm. Right, that's a great point, that we really are looking for research-based projects here. So although there could be a nexus, that's probably not, going to be the most appropriate for this call. How will application for the recent Prop 68 Chapter 10 RFP on coastal resilience affect review of application for this RFP? So for those of you who aren't aware, the climate team at OPC recently released a solicitation for projects relating to coastal resilience and sea level rise in particular. So these really are two pretty different solicitations. If I know the climate team is reviewing LOIs for that solicitation now. So if it was a project that maybe was more appropriate for this RFP, I know climate folks are going to be reaching out to those applicants and saying, hey, there is this other MPAs and climate RFP that might be a better fit for your LOI. What are match requirements? Another good question. We do not currently have match requirements, although Elise, can you remind me if in the scoring criteria, there are additional points for leveraged funding, correct?
I don't believe so. I don't think Holly Shand is on the call today, but I would have kicked it off to her. I don't believe there are.
Okay, let's make a note to Tova's shaking her head. No additional points for leveraged funding for match funds. Okay, cool. We can put that. That should definitely go on the FAQ, I think. Does completed mean construction needs to be completed by the end date? Again, these are really research-based projects. So, we will review LOIs for implementation type projects, but I think that it's just not going to be the best fit for the solicitation in particular. So I think that should hopefully answer that question. Another question, how do you see this RFP interacting with any long-term MPA monitoring efforts moving forward? We see those as separate. So there will be additional MPA monitoring funding, but this is really, again, more for research into the interaction between MPAs and climate. And so, pure monitoring projects would not be the best fit for this solicitation. Elise, do you agree with that?
Yes, I agree. We did write into our priorities that it needs to have adaptive management and lead to management tools. So, I mean, down the road, we would love to look at what comes out of this, but I agree with you, Mike.
Cool. Okay. Moving on, the first two priorities are research oriented, but Elise stated there must be direct management actions. Does that mean that there must be an implementation phase of a research project? No, so it's not so much about direct management actions as what are the management implications of the research, right? So the research projects need to very clearly link research outcomes with potential adaptive management actions that the state could take, for example, to strengthen our MPA network in the face of climate change, right? So that management connection needs to be very clear, but you don't need to go that next step further and start thinking about how to actually implement those management recommendations. It's just more about the actionable research component. Next question. I'm curious if there's a maximum ask for research projects, i.e. can't be X% more than the total requested. Does the research need to be conducted in partnership with a university, or is contracting a consulting company okay? Would one option improve your score over the other? So I'll answer the second part first. Does not need to be only in partnership with a research or with a university. So a consulting company would be okay. No preference given. It's more about the strength of the research that's proposed. And in terms of maximum ask, I think what you're getting at would be the project range that Elise described earlier. So that would be 250,000 minimum to $1 million maximum. And please raise your hand or drop something in the chat if I'm misunderstanding your question, but that is the range there that we're looking for. Our project involves trying to restore an endangered marine invertebrate. Would this type of project qualify? Potentially, as long, again, as there could be some sort of connection made to MPAs and climate resilience. So for example, if you're investigating the vulnerability of that species and to what extent it might or might not be protected by MPAs moving forward, I think that could be a good fit. Again, pure restoration or implementation projects without some sort of research component and management connection are not the best fit for this RFP. But at least I'll check with you on that one as well. Do you agree?
Yep. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. In the title, it's MPAs and climate. So as long as you're taking those two boxes and fitting within one of the three priorities, then it's game.
Okay, we are interested in seeing how creek restoration impacts water quality. If creeks feed directly into coastal wetlands, would research on that subject fit? It's hard to tell from just that brief summary, but I don't see an MPA nexus there necessarily. So remember that this does have to have that marine protected area network connection to be eligible. I saw a chat come in when I was talking about management implications, and it said, so recommendations, not necessarily building tools. I think it's either or. It just needs to be, again, action. The research needs to be action oriented. So a clear line needs to be drawn from, here are the outcomes of the research, and here are our recommendations, or perhaps we've built a tool that can aid resource managers in making decisions, but needs to be some sort of management connection clearly linked to the science. Another question, will regional or multiple study site proposals be prioritized over site specific? I don't know that we've discussed that explicitly. I think either are fair game. So I don't feel like I can make a determination on priority one way or the other right now without seeing the full context. Elise or Tova, do you have thoughts on that one, regional or statewide versus site specific?
Yeah, that's true. That's correct. The only way that a specific region will be prioritized is if it provides benefits to a severely disadvantaged community. So that's the only one that we've seen so far.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think, this is speaking a little bit off the cuff, but I do think that site-specific work might be hard in terms of answering those questions that Elise went over in those three broad buckets about characteristics of climate refugia and vulnerability and species distribution modeling. But if the connection can be made, then we'd certainly give it consideration. I see a note. Okay, a note for me to re-clarify an earlier answer. So, and we can definitely post this on the FAQ. So in terms of matching and leveraged funds, it sounds like we misspoke. There are 3 points in the rubric that do consider matched funding. So at most, if you have matched funds, you can score a whopping 3 points higher than projects with none. So thank you, Tova, for clarifying that. I appreciate that. Can you please clarify the date ranges for the start of the grant? What is the last date that the project could start? So as Elise noted, we're going to be bringing these projects for consideration at our February 2023 council meeting. So really the date range that we're looking at is spring 2023 for projects to actually hit the ground. Elise, do you have like I'm not sure what's meant here by the last date that the project could start.
Yeah, I think we were just trying to have things start as soon as possible. Everything should be complete and ready to go once approved. So I'm not quite sure what the last date means either.
And if whoever asked that question wants to.
Yeah, they just said in the chat, could it start in the summer or in the fall, or does it have to start in spring of 23?
I see. Well, the projects need to be wrapped by, was it summer 25?
Yep, summer 25.
So, right. So again, because of the management implications, we want results on a fairly tight timeline. So we're looking at summer 2025. And so if I don't think we'd be opposed to projects starting later as long as they wrapped by the end date. Cool. Are we open to projects that involve some sites outside of California? I do not believe so. I just don't think that there's a way to answer those three questions looking outside of California. So I see Elise and Tova shaking their heads. So no sites outside of California. California specific, please. What is meant by social resilience for priority topic 3? So again, I think important to look at the MPAs and climate report. They have a lot of thinking around what social resilience in a changing climate means in terms of coastal communities. So essentially, the first two questions are really about ecological resilience, and the second, we're looking for the human dimensions of that like question, right? And so how could the MPA network potentially strengthen or provide resilience to coastal communities as the climate changes? And there's additional detail in that MPAs and climate report. Elise, do you have additional clarification on that?
That's exactly what I was going to point them to, is to read that that document that came out last year, the MPAs and climate report, because there were a lot of recommendations for social resilience, human dimensions. So hopefully that can answer some of your questions. But yeah, we left it kind of up to the applicant to show us what kind of projects he would come up with.
Great, thank you. Are there maps indicating where disadvantaged communities visit MPAs to identify benefits to disadvantaged groups? No, I wish there were, because I think that would be a really helpful tool in terms of understanding visitation. But right now, all we have is that that map that Elise showed, showing where disadvantaged communities are located. So no, we don't have anything about the visitation right now. I don't see additional questions coming in the chat. Reminder, you can also go ahead and raise your hand if you want to ask your question out loud.
Just as a reminder, while you think of questions, this recording with all of the responses will be posted to the Prop 68 webpage, along with that written FAQ. So if you are not sure if your question was already asked and answered, we will have that for you available later on. But we do have another 15 minutes or so if anyone has questions for them now. And if not, I can hang out for another 5 minutes or so if anyone does think of questions. If not, oh, hey, a question. Wonderful.
So it looks like this is in response to the question about maps indicating where disadvantaged groups visit MPAs. So the follow-up question is, how do we identify benefits to disadvantaged groups at MPAs? I'm not 100% sure what's being asked here. I think to some extent that's on the the PIs of the proposal to figure out, right? So if you're interested in investigating that question, I think that's a connection that you need to make. And there is a line in that second bucket, more of an ecological bucket. But if you're proposing, I think it's extrapolatable to question 3 as well. So if you're proposing to work with community groups, right? Or I guess I should say, if you're proposing to answer questions that pertain to community groups, you should clearly lay out the methodology through which you're going to work with those community groups to kind of co-develop the priorities. Hopefully that helps to answer that question a bit. And last question, are there restrictions on what can be included in the budget? Yes, there are certain things that the state can pay for and certain things that the state can't. Generally, what we end up doing is kind of hammering those details out once projects are awarded, and we're going through the scope of work and budget with our administration and finance manager. So one of the things that we'd like eventually to do is be able to provide sort of a list of certain things, like things that are prohibited expenses, just so that you don't waste time putting them in the budget. Computers are a really good example. We actually can't pay for computers as part of our grant making process. But yeah, that's something that I would worry about down the road if your proposal is awarded. Okay, well, I think maybe I'll hand it back over to Elise to wrap us up. Oh wait, I see a couple more.
More came in, yes.
More coming in, more coming in. How do I propose that research be conducted without computers? The reason that we can't pay for computers is that we're trying to be effective stewards of taxpayer dollars, and our administration and finance secretary has made the determination that project expenses need to be one-time directly related to the project. So not to get too far off in the weeds here, but it's a higher level decision that's been made above our pay grade that computers, which can sort of be purchased and then used beyond the useful life of the grant are not something that we're going to be able to pay for. For the social proposal, is it allowable to include funding for people to participate in interviews, focus groups, etc.? Yes, absolutely. And in fact, I think that's best practice. So, so that would be good to see in the budget, paying people for their time. Should we reference the recent MPA decadal review? Yeah, I think the timeline may be a bit difficult because the decadal review is sort of ongoing and will be wrapping up in spring 2023 when these projects are getting off the ground. But to the extent that there can be outcomes of the decadal review that inform these projects, I think we'd definitely love to see that. But I just think the timing might be a little tight. It's not like, you know, the DMR, the decadal management review, is going to like be able to directly inform this work just because of the time mismatch there.
I will pop in to add, in the supplemental documents portion of the solicitation, we did use all of the long-term MPA monitoring reports that will be going into the MPA decadal review. So those are already out. You're welcome to use that in your data as well.
Yeah, great point. Great point. And really, I think we hope that the outcomes of these projects will inform adaptive management of MPAs post-decadal review, because the decadal review definitely isn't the end. There's going to be all kinds of recommendations coming out of that exercise that are going to move us forward into the future of adaptive management. Are region-wide projects prioritized? I think we covered this to some extent. I wouldn't say that they're prioritized necessarily. I think that you just have to do a good job connecting that regional work with, you know, broader statewide issues that are of interest to us. I see a comment from Rick Starr saying, Elise, you did a great job. I want to wholeheartedly echo that. Elise has been leading this process along with Lindsay, who she mentioned. And so, yeah, we're very, very excited to see this get off the ground. And that's it's been through Elise's hard work.
Thank you very much.
I see another question. Coastal communities in California are mainly at an advantage financially. Shouldn't the focus be on inner city communities affected by marine climate change? I think that's a fair point. And I think that if that's something that you want to investigate, that we would certainly entertain an LOI around that. When we say coastal communities, I think we're thinking about communities that are tied to the coast in any way, shape, or form, not necessarily just communities that are geographically located on the coast. And I see coastal communities in Northern California. Some coastal communities in Northern California are severely disadvantaged. Example, Klamath. Yes. Good point. How many lead PIs can be on one project? I see a note that was answered earlier. Can Elise or Tova, can you remind me of what the answer was to that? I don't think that we had.
No, it was not answered. Yeah.
Okay. Do we? I don't think we have a maximum number of PIs. Yeah. So build your dream teams, folks. No other questions coming in right now.
We do have about 9 minutes left. So if you think of any more questions, we'll hang out. If you need to go, thank you so much for spending your hour with us. We hope that you'll attend our virtual office hour, which will be next week, Thursday at 11 o'clock. All that information is on our Prop 68 webpage, as well as the solicitation. We'll hang out here. We're not going to leave yet. If you think of any questions, we'll hang out for a few more minutes. But thank you for those of you who have to head out.
Aren't regional, so there's a question from Mike, aren't regional MPAs and beaches pop-up disadvantaged communities? I'm not sure what's meant there. So Mike, you're welcome to jump in and clarify verbally if you wish. But again, I think there's a very specific definition in terms of Prop 68 for disadvantaged community and severely disadvantaged community. And so for us to consider a community, either a DAC or an SDAC, we need to be able to, it needs to be mapped on that state parks map that Elise showed earlier. See a question from Samantha, will we consider pilot studies? I would say yes, absolutely. In fact, I think a lot of this work is well suited for pilot studies.
Thank you. So I think we'll hang out for another couple of minutes. Feel free to come off mute and ask your question or type it in the chat box. If not, you can check out our Prop 68 webpage. Now's the time for all of you who are still hanging out with us. Ask your questions. We're still here. But if not, we understand. Thank you so much for spending your time with us.
Oh, Will White says, what if you promise to destroy the computer after the project? That's a great question, Will. Absolutely, that would be fine. You just have to destroy it in a really creative way and then post it on YouTube. Explosives are encouraged.
The state does not encourage explosives. Thank you, Mike.
Looks like we've got a clarification from Mike in here. Residents at disadvantaged communities will spend 8 hours at a beach in need of services, etc. So data is needed to determine interface with MPAs. Yeah, okay, I think I see what you're saying. And I think, yeah, in terms of an LOI that looks at sort of the ability for disadvantaged communities to access MPAs, we would definitely be interested in seeing that. I think that would fit well within that third bucket on social resilience. Elise, if you agree.
Definitely, yeah, that's a great idea. I like that.
Dennis, I see you got your hand raised. Do you want to jump in?
Just real quick, we're talking about funding here, but often every time I'm in these type of meetings, we don't seem to really include the people that can really make the difference. Sometimes we have to start off on a macro scale, and I'm wondering if you guys if this type of grant would cover that type of thing, like a rain garden rebate, if it's not in the area or something like that, because I see that that's typically really kind of underlooked because it's such a simple thing. So I want to get your idea on that.
Yeah, that's a great point, Dennis. And I think this this call is not really directed at those kinds of investments. They are important investments that I do agree that the state needs to make, but this is really more about advancing our scientific understanding of MPAs and climate resilience. So not a good fit for this call, but definitely an important, investment that OPC, I think other of our sister agencies should consider. And thanks for your question. I see another comment from Mike. We have 6 million visitors annually to Laguna, enjoying the benefits of MPAs. Yeah, absolutely. MPAs, I know, are a huge tourism draw down in Laguna.
We have 3 minutes left, so I encourage the rest of you still here on the call. If you have any last minute questions that will be beneficial for the good of the group, go ahead and ask it now. If not, thank you so much for joining us. We have a question.
From Samantha, on the opposite end of a pilot study, would this RFP consider funding projects that are in the end stages of analysis and publications? I think potentially, but again, we have to see sort of how that advances one or more of those 3 buckets. So if it's sort of, novel analysis using existing data sets, for example, that I think would be a good fit. But just in terms of like, I don't know, funding for a project that's sort of almost near completion and just needs additional funding, that might be tougher. Seems like we're winding down, but I defer to you, Elise. You let us know when it's time to wrap.
Yeah, I think this is probably a good ending point. So thank you all. Again, like I mentioned before, we will have our virtual office hour next week, Thursday at 11 o'clock. I'm also checking that Prop 68CH9 at resources.ca.gov email address. So please, if you think of any other questions in the next 5 minutes, I will be checking that email and we will get back to you as soon as we possibly can. Thank you so much for spending your hour with us. And Mike, we can stop recording.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.